Hello and welcome to another Cards and Cardboard review where we criticize and critique board and card games. Today we're looking at a two-player abstract game that both my wife and I really adore, and that is the Duke. Now, the Duke was a Kickstarter project back a few years. I missed out on it, but I was able to pick it up at retail, thankfully. But nowadays they've kind of reinterpreted a few of the rules and have made kind of a sister version called the Jarl. So we're actually taking a look at both of them, so consider this kind of a double review. Now, both games are a tile-laying abstract where you are positioning your units to try to capture your opponent's king or Jarl. In this case, it's the Duke or the Jarl. And how you do that is you've got kind of a standard set of units that you start with, and you're going to bring them across the map and try to dominate their pieces. But also, you can bring more tiles out from a bag, which is kind of adding a little element of randomness to it, which is a nifty way of really spicing up a game that feels fairly classical. So we're going to take you into the box and show you what you get. So now that we're in kind of our collection here, brief description of everything here. We do currently own everything that's available retail for the Duke and the Jarl. However, we don't have any of the Kickstarter or tournament promos and exclusives. So we're going to kind of organize these a little bit and kind of show them off bit by bit here, so that way you're a little set up to understand what all comes inside each little thing when you get it. Okay, so starting with the Duke. Now, what you'll get in the Duke here is a set of tiles over here that are for two different flags for a variant game mode, a mountain, which is a terrain piece, which can also be used to affect the gameplay, and a dragon tile, which is nice and black, and it's a neutral piece. You will also get two bags of tiles, a kind of pinky one and then one with a blue thing here, and that's how you kind of determine where your teams are depending on how you actually stack these up and put them in. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to start the game with your Duke and have your two little foot soldiers come out and defend them, which these are all dual-sided little things, and the instance of the game is pretty much a simple movement game from here. You can move based on these various movement effects, which are also found in a little quick reference guide, as well as the other quick reference guide here, and then those nicely well-written rulebook, and a little reminder on the back here. And whenever you move a piece, you'll flip it over, and then you'll get a new movement allowance. And of course, the goal of the game is to go to the other person's side and capture whatever the piece that happens to be there. This can also be variant based on, getting this flag and then moving it back to your side, or trying to capture a certain number of pieces, or heck, there's even kind of a drafting rule in there where you can say, I get this piece, but you don't get access to that piece now. So that's kind of just a quick little preview of what you get in just the base Duke game. So these are all the various expansions that are currently available for the Duke at this time. You have one of these sets, which is actually a 3-tile per side customizable set, which comes with sticker sheets, so you can actually make your own custom tiles with the front and the back. Or you could always bypass these stickers if you're particularly good at wood burning or using a Sharpie, and also have play tested around with some tiles. The first expansion I'll talk about was one of the first ones to release, and that was the Robert E. Howard set, which is focused around Conan and Krull and various characters of the Robert E. Howard universe. Now, these are actually unique because these are what you would call kind of variant tiles. They are very much a red tint here to kind of give you a core difference from how you use them in gameplay. Now, the difference is, well, there's two ways to play with these. One is you could have them as a mercenary unit where I take one, you take one, and we can have them in our bags to come out and play normally. The other way is actually if you're the first person to pull out a certain tile from your bag, say like a champion unit, you can actually remove that champion unit from your bag and replace it with one of these mercenary figures. And that's kind of an interesting way of approaching it. Now, one of the things I don't like about these first expansions is that they actually came with like little printed paper rules, which I have thankfully held on to, and they have maintained presents in my box before getting too wrinkled, but eventually these will wear out and decay over time, so I might want to actually laminate these or find an updated replacement. This also applies to two of the different module sets, which we actually have are the Arthurian Legends, or actually three. The Arthurian Legends, the Robin Hood set, and the Musketeer set. Now these come with a set of different tiles for both sides, depending on if you want to be the good guys or the bad guys, such as the ones for the Arthurian Legends set here, and this actually comes with a special tile as well called the Fort, which also is Camelot. As you can see here, it's a little dual-sided number here. So you can actually apply the Fort in gameplay, which was written into the rules of the original Duke, but wasn't actually in the original Duke. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself here. You've got a set of these tiles which replace tiles in your bag for their unique abilities. In this case, say like Arthur's obviously the new Duke, and Merlin replaces the Seer piece or the Wizard piece from the base game. And then on the enemy side, you have Morgana and Mordred, which you need to actually requires you to take out both of these guys. Now, Morgana starts out in play, and the variant rules basically say as soon as Mordred comes out, then you actually have to take on both. You'll see this in kind of these unique scenarios where you have to change the win conditions. The Musketeer set is very interesting because you have to take in all of the Musketeers or bring in Richelieu. And then with the Robin Hood set, well, the goal of course is to take in Robin Hood, but then again you also have to take out the Sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John. So you got kind of an interesting little storyline going for those games. Now these are very much a interesting variant to the game. I would heavily recommend playing these if you're thinking your game's getting a little dull, but by no means get these because they are very much their own scenarios, but there are ways you could integrate these into the main game through drafting or otherwise, assigning them some sort of arbitrary point total and playing with them still. So our next two bags here are two different things entirely. One is the siege weapons, which again is another mercenary type one, but these ones came in little plastic cases which have their own little rulebooks that go with them that are part of the actual packaging. Now this is not a bad idea because these are a little bit stockier, but again I could see these wearing out over time, but I'd rather have these over these flimsy little paper ones. Now, what's interesting about the siege weapons is that these are actually what is considered redeployable. So they actually added a new rule to the game where once these are captured, they can actually be transferred sides or go back to the middle and then rehired later on. So you can have kind of this interesting thing where you might almost want to get two sets of these because of the fact that there's a full set of these already in play, and they can be hired into one side or the other. So keep that in mind when you're doing your purchasing, because you never know. You might want to change it up that way. Now here's my favorite of all of the expansions. It's actually a thing called the City Troops Pack. Now the City Troops Pack actually introduces a few new tiles, which I don't have quite all of them in here, but the idea is that these are unique and different starting tiles which you can use to replace, say, the footman or the various other things like the assassin pieces in your bag. Now you can choose some of these, or you can choose to replace all of them. And when you do that, your opponent doesn't necessarily have to make those decisions either. So you got a lot of interesting replayability factor just with that alone. And again, more building of your bag to customize it uniquely to your playstyle, maybe a bit more. So, like magic appears the Jarl. So the Jarl has just one big rules reference sheet and a rulebook, and it does say it's fully compatible with the Duke. And when I mean that, it means that you can play one bag of these tiles versus any sort of tiles that come from the Duke. However, there's a few things from the expansions that you might need the house rule or figure out what the rules are on that. Now, the thing I really don't quite like about this is the fact that these are both the same color bags. So you gotta really worry about maybe marking these down so you know which one's the white tiles and which ones are the black tiles. Now, It's an interesting approach what they did with these, and you'll see that these are clearly different in several ways from the Duke tiles. One thing to note is that certain tiles actually have a little nick in the side of them here, which is visible on here as well as on the printing of it. I'll have to get these just a bit closer because it's really hard to kind of see that little nick in there, but you can kind of see it on both sides that there's just a slight difference in there. Now most of the tiles have this, some of them don't though. This one in particular is a little bit more clean, and you won't be able to actually see any sort of nicks on the side. So you will actually have a little bit of a textural difference. However, that's very, very minor, and really truly if you're being an honest player, you won't cheat like that. Now the other thing on there is that the various text on here, for some of them, is a little harder to read, particularly on these black ones, because you've got this interesting text font choice, and then you also have the fact that they use a material with a little bit of gray and white in it, so you might confuse certain areas on the tile for movements if you're bad of sight. So that's something that's not quite really good for the game, but it's definitely not going to hinder it that much. So you'll see that in kind of our final thoughts. I really do like these ones because they are chunky and they feel nice, and you know, honestly, who doesn't like, you know, this nice heavy plastic feeling here? And the game plays extremely similar to the Duke, just without some of the special abilities. So keep that in mind, like some of these extra special abilities that some of the tiles have in the Duke, you will not necessarily have that when you're playing with the Jarl. However, you will notice that things like the Jarl token here have a much broader movement range and different types of movement when compared to the Duke tiles. So these are much more modular in the sense that they have a little bit more options given to them for movement at the sacrifice of not having any skills. So with that being shown off, we're going to take you kind of right into the final thoughts here and give you kind of a side-by-side comparison final thoughts here so you can decide if any of these games are actually in your current wheelhouse or something that you're desiring to buy. Okay, so now that we're out of the box, we're going to go right into some final thoughts here. So this is going to be a little weird because I got to review two games in one sitting here. So let's go through them side by side. We'll start with the Duke. So the Duke starts off with a rulebook here, which we're going to put at a solid 7. Now the reason why I give it a 7 is some of the wording does get a little long in there and a little confusing. For quite a while, my wife and I were a little confused how the summon ability worked as opposed to actually bringing units out of the bag. It ends up those are two separate actions that we didn't even really correlate into until we actually read the rules a few more times. Not to mention there's a lot of optional rules and variant rules in there that can kind of muddle things up unless you read all the rules in particular. With the expansion rules that came with the little tile sets, those ones are a little simple to understand, but there are some things in the errata that you kind of got to worry about, such as different abilities affecting each other and various effects that have their own kind of little timing elements that really aren't that confusing, but there are some cases where things get a little quirky. So artwork. This game doesn't really have much artwork. There's only really the layout of the tiles themselves. So as I said earlier, you've got the two sides which are very clear about where they are with the graphic design choices, and it's very nice to see what abilities are on there as well for the ones that actually do have abilities. However, there are a few little nitpicks. There are certain units where they actually have a different range where the little piece is not actually in the center of it. It'd be kind of nice if there was an easier way to tell what the offset was on that. Not to mention, it would have been kind of nice to maybe have like a little staining on there just to give it a little different effect for the grid pattern, because some people I know are always counting with their fingers to try to figure out what things are. That's just a tiny, tiny nitpick. And of course I understand if you were to stain them differently, you could confuse them for the defense symbols. So that being said, artwork, it's really nice. Everything is laid out perfectly well. There might be a few spelling errors, I think, that somebody brought up for the Musketeer set, but other than that, I don't even notice that. So We're gonna give artwork, it's working due. It's got a 9. Only a point or two off for minor nitpicks. And all the box artwork and all that stuff is kind of superfluous. So maybe you see, again, maybe a few hexes colored differently on the playing field area there, the area where you're laying out your tiles. That would probably be just another minor nitpick. Something you can do in your free time if you feel like customizing it or making your own board. So components. These are solid, chunky wood. I really like that. It's something you can hold onto. It's got a classic feel. It looks good, and you can clearly see it from across the table. And when you come into these things where you're having to kind of compare your units to your opponent's units, but you can't flip theirs over either and know what's on the other side, that's just kind of some brilliance in the design of the game as well. Going on to what I feel about the other tiles, we'll get into that with the Jarl segment after this. But component quality, I can't really deny that this is really good. It came with bags, it came with a good stock rulebook. It kind of be nice if the expansions came in some sort of little better container, which they are working on for the little plastic things. However, those still don't quite work well, but trying to mix those into your box, and you might find yourself having to get a new box. So we're going to go 9. Just because of that, tiny, tiny little issue. Oh, man. So we're going into mechanisms. Now, the mechanisms of this game are brilliant. There's no way to really bring that up. Everything's laid out well. All of the movement is very concise, and it's written in the rules very well. You got these little reference sheets that are perfect for having you understand what a tile does right away. There's a few minor things in there with defense and dread and these other icons and the finicky nature of adding in, terrain elements or the dragon and dealing with jump slides and that stuff. But that's very, very minor. So I'm going to have to give this a 9. Because I can't think of anything really all that wrong with this game except for the few small fiddly bits that need a little bit of rules explanation to them. The game itself is a solid system where you're constantly choosing between moving pieces on the board and bringing out more pieces onto the board. And that can really give you this interesting game where you have this cluttered field that's constantly trading off back and back. And then ultimately leading into this thing where eventually somebody's going to get cornered and taken out. So great mechanisms in this game. So finally we have replayability. Now replayability for this kind of game is just already huge, especially with the nature of the random tile draws and the variance of how many tiles there are, and the variants that come in the box are just astronomically huge. I can't give this anything other than like a 9. Because of the fact that the replayability of it is just that high. Especially if you like two-player abstracts. That being said, you're going to have a bit of the samey nature with the startups, but that's about it. And if you really want to change that up, there are options with the expansions, which I might add aren't too, they're not too expensive to get. And these variant rules are very good for changing things up, having different scenarios, and they can just be unique tiles that you can kind of mix and match and throw into the game for like points or something. If somebody out there actually does comes up with the idea of building a point system for putting tiles into the game, or having mercenary tiles, much like the Conan and Krull that I showed earlier, the ones where you actually get to switch those out. Those are just brilliant little things that are built into this game from right start away. And the fact that you can make custom ones too, just everything adds to that replayability factor. The only thing that nitpick is the same starting scenario, and that's about it. So going right into your final thoughts, it's pretty obvious. I really adore the Duke, and it's a great game. It's got a lot of great things going for it, and my wife and I absolutely enjoy playing it anytime we can. So given what I've marked on, I can't give it anything less than a 9 for our final thoughts. So now we go into the Jarl. So the Jarl's, again, the sister game to the Duke, and they can be played against each other. However, Christy and I haven't really tried that much. Now, I'm going to go through the final thoughts here, and they're going to match up quite a bit, but there are going to be some differences. So, artwork. Artwork in this game is a little finicky for me because of the way the tiles are. Now, the tiles are fine, they're nice and chunky, and that's going to go into the component section. But because of the material they're made of, for the particular black ones, they have maybe a little bit of white area on there that can kind of confuse people when it comes to movement and stuff. Particularly in some cases where there's like smaller dots to be concerned with. And the tiles themselves are kind of grooved in such a way, like they have been chipped away at to give them a kind of a stone feel. That's a little inconsistent, but for textural things, it's in the bag that way. It does give it a good aesthetic. So again, I gotta give this a 9 because of just how good the artwork is on it and how it holds up. However, I'm probably going to bring it down just a little bit more to that 8 because of the text on the actual tiles being so hard to read. And that's something that's really clear in there. So again, that's really a minor thing, but it does count towards artwork. So I got to give it that. The rulebook, which I've kind of skipped, is pretty much the exact same thing as the Duke rulebook, except without a lot of the finicky extra rules, and honestly has cleaned up some of the details of what movement does. And you also have no special abilities for the tiles, so actually the rulebook has been cleared up to a 10. And that's pretty great because this is more of like the intro game to kind of get you started for something more heavier, maybe like the Duke. Not to say that the Jarl isn't heavy as it is, it's just it doesn't have nearly as much complexity as the Duke would have if you mixed in all the special abilities and stuff. So component quality. Who can really argue with solid, thick, heavy plastic there? It's a good component quality, it's going to last much longer than wood, and it's going to stay very clean, especially if you take it outdoors, which makes it a more portable game. The playing field, I wish, was a bit more defined, though. Much like the Duke, it would be nice to maybe see a little few, gridding in intervals in there. However, the lines are just a little bit thinner and a little harder to see, maybe in certain environments, but we really had no problems with that. So, I guess the component quality, I mean, it's a solid 10. I mean, you can't go wrong with what you get in this box, especially for value and what you kind of play with. It's a great experience, it feels good, and everything is solid. Whew. So now we're going to go into the mechanisms. Now, the mechanisms in this game are very much that of the Duke, except with less special abilities. So that being said, the tiles themselves are pretty well balanced against that. They have a little bit more movement range, they have a little bit more special abilities built into them, like the defense and the dread. So that is pretty much all I can say about that. The mechanics are still sound, they're still solid. Again, I gotta give them a good 9 for that. Only taking the few points off again for just the fiddly nature of some of the questions that might come up for people. So replayability. Now, here's the thing about the Jarl that suffers a little bit. The Jarl will be consistently kind of the same game, and again, you'll have the replay factor because of the random nature of the bag draws. However, that being said, we are having a lot less replayability as compared to the Duke. Unless, of course, you own both, and then in which case your replay factor just climbs up a little bit more. However, I still have to give a few points off, down to probably about an 8 for the Jarl. Because being a two-player abstract game is great. It's going to have a lot of that replay factor built in. However, the samey setup and the same tiles coming out, there's a lot of play-in versus counterplay, so there's not a lot of customization as compared to the Duke. And the setup and scenarios are going to be pretty much the same. So, where do I go from here? We've done 2 final thoughts. We've compared these 2 games together. What do I think in all? Well, I think that these are 2 very great games on their own right. And if you have the chance to pick up one or the other, definitely consider a few of the factors in here. But definitely pick these up if you're particularly a fan of two-player abstracts. And that's mainly because, sometimes you want to get away from chess. And chess is a game with a lot of pure strategy to it. And if you have somebody who's clearly going to beat another person, it's not going to really help bring that person up very much in the long time because, they got to keep playing to get better. With the Duke and the Jarl, you have just that little bit of element of randomness that gives the amateur players a little bit more of an edge to catch up with people who are more kind of chess mastery level good with two-player abstracts. And that still isn't to say that it's going to be unfair, or it's still going to be fair, because maybe they'll think of a few moves in advance, or they'll calculate the odds of what's in their bag. And again, this is one of those games where easy to learn, difficult to master. And with mastery comes an understanding of what all you're drawing, what kind of potential pool you got. Heck, even the customability of bringing in a certain set of tiles versus another set of tiles can really change the game up and really give some people an edge, especially people who want to maybe learn some different things from chess or and kind of bring that into their game. So that being said, I'm done with this review. Thank you so much for watching our Cards and Cardboard criticism and critique of both the Duke and the Jarl. And I've been Benjamin Hernandez, and I've been proud to present these two games to you.